Alright, hey everyone. Today we are going to be talking about Unit 7, which covers Civil War and Reconstruction. So this is really the kind of climax of American History 1. Everything so far, all the way back to the American Revolution, you can see how the Civil War is starting to form, the causes of it, and eventually it will happen in 1860. And we've already talked about that a little bit with Fort Sumter and stuff like that in Unit 6, but we're going to go more in depth with it now. So, the first term we need to talk about is the plan by the North to try to defeat the South, and that's going to be called the Anaconda Plan. So, if you remember back to the screencast from this unit, there's a picture of a snake that was wrapped all the way around the South, which was an anaconda, so really like big snake. And so the theory behind this plan is that you're going to cut off the South economically. So you're not really trying to, in a sense, fight the South directly. You're trying to hurt them in their pocketbook with their money. And if you hurt them with their money, then that way you would basically crash their economy and then they would have no will to fight. So the Anaconda Plan said that we're going to put a blockade around the southern coastline all the way from Virginia down across the Gulf of Mexico to Texas. Well, if you do this, then you're not going to allow any type of international trading to happen in a southern port. And so, whenever you don't allow any trade to happen, that means the South cannot bring anything from a foreign country in. That way, they're not getting any food or ammunition or anything like that. They're going to have to deal with the war with the supplies they have already in the South, and they don't have a lot. So that's going to hurt them quite a bit. They're also not going to be able to trade stuff like cotton and make money off of that. So they're not getting the supplies and they're not getting any money. So that's not a good plan for the South. Another thing that they want to do is to basically divide the Confederacy in half. So if you capture the Mississippi River, which runs along here, with if you follow the mouse, if you cut the South off here, they can't trade, and so you can't put any products on the Mississippi River and try to trade them in New Orleans, even if the blockade didn't happen. And then also you're dividing the Confederacy up into two parts, and if they're divided up into two parts, they would be easier to conquer. So Anaconda Plan two parts, but it was effective, and we'll talk about how it was effective later on. So another thing that kind of goes on when we talk about the Civil War is the New York City draft riots. So uh, the Union during the Civil War is going to issue a draft, and a draft just means that there's going to be people that are randomly selected to fight in the war, and they don't have any other choice but to fight in the war. And the problem with this is that whenever the draft was implemented, it wasn't really implemented fairly. Some people could pay, I think it was around $500 to get out of having to fight in the war if they were randomly picked to fight. Well, the problem is that if you remember talking about the first industrial revolution and the immigration as a result of that, uh, the poor people, especially the Irish, are not going to have very much money, and so they cannot basically buy their way out of having to fight. And so while they're seeing the rich people able to do that and they can't, they're going to be very, very angry about that and they're going to riot. The kind of epicenter of that riot is going to be in New York City. And so they didn't like that. They also didn't like the idea that they're going to have to go fight a war to help free any type of Southern slaves. And so they're going to turn their anger toward the free blacks that are already in the North because they're saying, well, we're going to have to go fight to protect you. They really didn't think that they had any reason to do that. It didn't affect them. And on top of that, they're being forced to do it while other people can buy their way out of it. So you can see how they kind of felt angry because of that. They're going to riot in New York City. So, getting into the battles of the Civil War, we're going to go through some of them that are the most important. You don't really need to know what actually happened at that battle. You need to know more the effects of that battle as it relates to the war. So the first one is going to be the Battle of Bull Run. There's technically two battles of Bull Run, but we're going to be talking about the first one. And this will be the first major battle of the Civil War after Fort Sumter. So at the Battle of Bull Run, what you're going to see is that there's going to be a lot of people, especially in the North, in the Union, that think the war is going to go over very quickly. They think the Union will win, and the South really doesn't stand much chance of dragging the war out, and much less getting their independence. Well, the Battle of Bull Run is going to take place outside of Washington, D.C., and the North is so confident in themselves, there's even going to be some people that come out on the hillside and they're going to basically have a picnic and watch the battle, but what they see is not what they were expecting. This battle was very bloody, it was very brutal, and in the end, the Confederacy put up a very strong fight and it was strong enough to where they won that battle. So the North did not get what they were expecting. They thought that this battle the North would win. They would win so overwhelmingly that the war would be over at this point, and that didn't happen at all. In fact, the South won. So it showed the war is going to be very, very long. It was bloody. This battle was very bloody. A lot of people got killed. And so it really kind of shocked the North a little bit. So another battle that's going to be really bloody is the Battle of Antietam. In fact, the Battle of Antietam, to this date, as of April 2019, is the bloodiest day in American history. And so the Battle of Antietam is going to happen, and it's going to be very, very bloody, like we've talked about. You can see here there's a sunken road through this battlefield, and it talks about how there's just piles of bodies because of this battle. But that's not what is important. The importance of this battle is that Abraham Lincoln knows that the northern citizens are seeing images like this one. They're seeing their children, their sons, being murdered, and the people in the north are saying, for what? We should just let the south go on their own as they please and not have to go through all of this. So Lincoln is going to have to inspire these people somehow, and one way he's going to do that is after this battle and how bloody it is, he'll issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and we'll talk about it in just a minute. But it's going to attach a moral cause to the war, and people in the north see the war now as a fight to eradicate slavery in the South, and when they see that, they know that they're actually fighting for something, for a more humanitarian cause in the Civil War. Another thing this is going to do is that when the South is going to lose this battle, England is not going to uh, consider helping the Confederacy anymore at this point because the South and Britain were trading a lot of cotton back and forth. They had a really good trading relationship. England was considering helping the South, but after this battle, the England is not going to do that, and that's really going to hurt the South. Really, the only way the South could have won is if England helped them, and when they don't, that's a really big blow to the South. So, after the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln is going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, the Emancipation Proclamation says that any Southern slave in the South, after the Union forces have invaded and taken that kind of area over, any slave in that area is now free. And so, when he issued it, he said that, you know, unilaterally every slave in the South is free, but because the South did not recognize Lincoln as their president, it took the Union forces invading to free the slaves. But the importance of this Emancipation Proclamation is that it's going to help Northern morale. As we talked about before, people in the North are going to see it as more of a war to abolish an evil in the country. Remember, during the Second Great Awakening, they're going to view slavery as a sin against society. And so, and now that you're fighting a war to eradicate a sin, more people are going to be willing to do that. So that'll boost Northern morale. More people in the North are going to support the war, at least temporarily. Another thing that it'll do is keep England from helping the Confederacy. And we'll talk about, or like we've already talked about, the South really needed England to help them. And once England decides not to do that and give them their support, uh, it's really going to hurt the Confederacy. They don't have much of a chance after this, but they're going to try to drag the war out. because they think that if they can drag the war out, enough people in the North will get tired of the war. We've talked about the morale, and really the North is going to have to keep their morale up long enough for the South to give up, and eventually they will. But that's not a given. It took things like the Emancipation Proclamation to do that. Um, and so another battle we need to talk about is the siege of Vicksburg. So remember talking about the Anaconda Plan and how uh, the second part of that plan was to divide the Confederacy in half along the Mississippi River. Well, you're going to see some Union generals that are going to invade from the south. Some are going to come down from the north, like General Ulysses Grant. You've probably heard of him before. They're going to meet in Vicksburg, and when they meet in Vicksburg, he's going to surround Vicksburg, which is what a siege is. You're surrounding that city, and eventually they're going to run out of supplies because, like the first part of the Anaconda Plan was to blockade the southern coastline, the South cannot get any supplies. Well, you sort of have a mini Anaconda Plan within the town of Vicksburg. Same thing happens, they run out of supplies, and they're going to have to surrender. When they surrender, the Confederacy is now divided in half. Whenever it's divided in half, it's easier to conquer. So that was a turning point battle. After this, in the Western Theater, we'll get to the turning point in the Eastern Theater later on. But at this point, the Confederacy is now divided. Ulysses Grant is seen as a very popular general. In fact, he's popular enough, and Abraham Lincoln likes him enough that he will go to the Eastern Theater and fight Robert E. Lee, which is widely considered to be the best general in the Civil War as far as military tactics and things like that. And they will meet up and fight in Virginia, but we will talk about that later on. Another turning point battle, but this one is in the Eastern Theater, is the Battle of Gettysburg. So this is going to happen in Pennsylvania. And at the Battle of Gettysburg, what's going to happen is you're going to see Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, try to invade Pennsylvania, which is a part of the Union. And he thinks, and now his goal is not to invade the Union and conquer the entire northern states. He just wants to kind of mess with the Union, for lack of a better word, and uh, basically kill a bunch of their soldiers. And people in the North are going to see a lot of their soldiers killed, like in this one. And whenever that happens, the people in the North are like, look, we're seeing all these people killed for what? Why are we still fighting this war? We could just let the South go, make peace with them, and this will not happen. These pictures will not happen. And so what Lincoln is going to have to do is another kind of emancipation proclamation almost. He's going to have to boost their morale again. This time he doesn't issue a formal proclamation, he goes and makes a speech. So this battlefield, after the war is over, they're doing some kind of memorial or dedication, and Lincoln is going to give his very famous speech, the Gettysburg Address. It's the one that starts off 407 years ago, and he talks about how the people that have died at the Battle of Gettysburg and in all of the battles of the Civil War, if we do not keep fighting the war and we don't win the war, then these people would have died in vain. And so people in the North are going to listen to him, and they're like, we don't want our sons may have been killed, but if we don't keep this war on, then they're going to be dead for no reason. So they think we have to win, or there's going to be no purpose for them dying. So that's going to boost their morale up more after a very bloody battle, the Battle of Gettysburg. It's the biggest one in the Civil War. So we also need to talk about some atrocities that happened in the Civil War, and one of those is Andersonville Prison. So Andersonville Prison is going to be in the South. It's a Confederate war prison. So after some of these battles, they would capture Union soldiers, and they're now a prisoner of war. And so they'd be sent to this war prison, and they're going to be held against their will, obviously. But what's going to happen at Andersonville Prison is very, very gruesome. They're basically going to be starved to death, these soldiers. This guy here, if you didn't know any better, and I just showed you this picture, you'd probably say this guy was a victim of the Holocaust or of Nazi Germany, but this guy was a former Union soldier. And they're going to be starved to death. Other people are going to look just like him, extremely malnourished, and they're not going to get food. They're not going to get food because really The South does not have very much food to begin with, and if they do have food, they're not going to give it to their prisoner of war or their prisoners of war. They're going to give them to their soldiers, and so there's also going to be a lot of disease there. Uh, and there's really no medical professionals around to treat that disease, and if there are any around, again, they're going to go help the Confederate soldiers, not the Union prisoners of war. So this was a very, very gruesome sight. It was a bad time for the Union soldiers in the prisons. In fact, the guy that ran Andersonville prison will be executed after the war because of, really gruesome things that happened, like this guy here. So another thing or another battle that's going to be really important for the Civil War is Sherman's March to the Sea. So this is another thing that will help boost the Northern morale. And what's going to happen is a Union general named General Sherman. He's going to leave Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he's going to march all the way to Savannah, Georgia, and then up into North Carolina. And so it's going to be the march to the sea because he gets to Savannah and then he turns north. And what he's going to do during his march to the sea along this arrow here is leave a path of destruction through total war. So, total war is when you go and you're not only fighting a war against the Confederate soldiers, you're also going after their civilians. Now, he didn't really go and massacre their civilians, but he did, for example, go in and take their food. He would burn their homes. He would burn their cotton fields, and he would mess up and dig up their gardens. He would take their food from them, and so they didn't have very much food to begin with, but he took what they had. There's some stories of him and his soldiers going in a home, basically running the family out, eating that family's food, and then lighting their house on fire. So that's total war. You're going after everything that has value in the South. You see here they're also ripping up the railroads in the South. The railroads are important because they can distribute their soldiers around. They can distribute food around the South. And the South didn't have very many railroads to begin with. And if you mess up just a few of them, like in Atlanta, uh, then you're going to disrupt the whole Southern economy just by taking out one or two railroads. And that's what they did. And the purpose of doing this is that you're going to try to get the South to see the war as something that's going really bad for them. And if you're raiding people's homes, burning their houses, you're trying to get them to say enough already. We're going to give up. And that was his goal in doing this. So eventually that strategy will work out a little bit. Another thing I need to say about the March to the Sea is that it's going to help Abraham Lincoln be reelected in 1864 because the South is going to start to think more about surrender after this, and that'll help Lincoln, rack up some battle victories before he's reelected, and more people will vote for Lincoln because of this. Anyway, the next battle, the last battle we're going to talk about is the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. This will be the last battle in the Civil War, and it's important because it is the battle that ended the Civil War. Robert E. Lee here on the left surrendered to Ulysses Grant. Uh, they're going to fight a little bit in Virginia after Grant captured Vicksburg. Lincoln is going to send him to fight in the Eastern Theater. He's going to basically chase Robert E. Lee around the countryside in Virginia. That's called the Wilderness Campaigns. Eventually, with Sherman's March to the Sea, a lot of people in the South are going to have their property destroyed. The Wilderness Campaign is going to take a toll on Lee's army. They're going to surrender. The Civil War will be over at this point. And the thing that's important about this battle, though, is that after it's over, General Grant is going to let the Southern soldiers go home, and really, he's not going to punish them. He's not going to take them as prisoners of war. He's going to say, "Go home to your families. We need to get over this." And he was kind of echoing Abraham Lincoln because that's what Lincoln wanted to do. So it shows that they're kind of setting up for reconciling with the South after this war is officially over. So after the war is over, you're going to see the 13th Amendment being passed. What the 13th Amendment is going to do is abolish slavery nationwide. So after the Civil War is over, the question of whether or not slavery will exist within uh, the western part of the country will not happen because it cannot exist anywhere in the country. It will not exist in the South. And so this is really an extension of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Keep in mind that the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the South, while the 13th Amendment will apply everywhere. There will be no more slavery in any part of the United States as a result of this amendment. Uh, and whenever the South loses some of their slaves, that's going to take a toll on their economy. Stuff like Sherman's March already took a toll on the economy. This will really hurt the South. But we're going to talk about later on when we get to Reconstruction how slavery kind of came back in the South, but under a different name. And conditions for the blacks in the South, the ex slaves, will really not be much better. But we'll talk about that later on. Another amendment that's going to be passed, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, let me go ahead and say, is called the Civil War Amendments or the Reconstruction Amendments. All of them are going to be passed as a result of the Civil War and in response to the Civil War. So after all of the slaves are going to be freed as a result of the 13th Amendment, then you're going to have to decide how they're going to be treated. Are they going to be treated as immigrants? Are they going to be treated as people that have lived in the country their whole lives and treated as citizens? Well, the 14th Amendment will answer that with the response of black citizenship. They're not going to be treated as outsiders. They're going to be treated as people within the country. They've been here their whole lives. So, what the Union is going to say as a result of this, and the South really will not have much say at this point. The Union will say, let's give them citizenship, but also let's give them equal protection under the law. So that means that if these Southern blacks, these ex slaves, are in a court of law or if they are just out within society, they have to be treated equally, the same as a white person within the country. And so this is really going to be important. It's going to be good for the blacks, at least temporarily, in the South. Eventually, the South will go against the 14th Amendment. We'll talk about that later on, but it is a good first step. And what you're going to see is that conditions for the blacks in the South will get better, at least temporarily, because they're going to be seen as an equal under the law, but that will not work out, forever. Another thing or another amendment, the last Civil War amendment or Reconstruction amendment, will be the 15th Amendment. And so the 15th Amendment is going to say that if you are a black male, then you can vote in the South. You can vote anywhere in the country. And this doesn't apply to black women at this point because the 19th Amendment is what will establish suffrage for women. But black men can now vote in the South. And this is really a slap in the face, if you will, for the whites in the South. At this point, they have viewed the blacks in the South as slaves their whole lives, as not even humans. And now you're going to have to allow these people the ability to have equal protection under the law. They're going to be seen as an equal to whites. They can also vote. If you can vote, then that also means that the Southern blacks, these ex slaves, can run for office. And what you will see is that a lot of the former slaves will run for office and will be elected to office. And that's really not going to go over well for the whites in the South because whenever the ex-slaves or the blacks are in power over the whites, they have kind of a leadership position, and the South doesn't like that because they don't even view them as people or as humans, and you're now giving them the ability to lead the nation or the state or whatever it may be. And what you're going to see is that in the South, for at least a short period of time, the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, is going to be dominant in the South, at least for a little while. Eventually, like the other amendments, the South will find a way to go and kind of get around the 15th Amendment, but we'll talk about that later on. So, After the Civil War is over, you're going to have to find a way to get over the Civil War to kind of bring the country back together. And what this time period will be called is Reconstruction. So, during the period of Reconstruction, all of these southern states that have now seceded, they have lost, they did not gain their independence. Well, they're going to have to be readmitted to the Union as a state. And there's going to be a lot of debate over that, whether the state should come in kind of freely right after the war is over, or should they be punished, and should there be a condition to them being readmitted. And eventually, they're going to be readmitted under some conditions with the Military Reconstruction Act, but we'll talk about that later on. Another thing that will be important during the period of Reconstruction is what's going to happen to the rights of freedmen. Now, freedmen are just people that used to be slaves, but because of the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation, they're no longer slaves. And whenever they are no longer slaves, the issue of what you're going to do with them, what rights they're going to have, is going to come up. We've already talked about how that gets addressed somewhat with the Civil War amendments or the Reconstruction amendments, but we'll talk about how the South can get around that later on. So, within the time period of Reconstruction, the South is really not going to have any say in Congress. And in Congress, what people are going to do is elect a lot of people like this guy here. This guy is Thaddeus Stevens, and he is a radical Republican. So, the radical Republicans were a group of people within Congress that did not want the South to be able to come back into the Union without any punishment. They wanted the South to be punished for seceding from the Union and for treating their slaves the way that they did. And they want the South to become more of a, and this is a second part of their goal, they want the South to become more based around manufacturing, based around factories and stuff like that. In essence, they wanted the South to look more like the North. They wanted the South to treat the freedmen with respect, with dignity. They wanted the freedmen to be able to vote and have equal protection. They wanted them to be treated just like any other person would in the South. And so they didn't want the South to be able to do what they wanted. Now, people like Abraham Lincoln uh, is going to say, no, the South should be able to come back into the Union. We should try to make up with the South and try to get over and get behind the Civil War. People like this guy, Thaddeus Stevens, is not going to go along with that. And for a while, the radical Republicans will be in power, and stuff like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments will be passed under radical Republicans, but over time, the power of radical Republicans will go away, and more moderate Republicans, the Republicans that don't really care as much about revolutionizing the South, will gain power in Congress, and that's when the South can sort of start to get away with treating blacks and the freedmen as second-class citizens. So, something that the radical Republicans are going to help pass is the Freedmen's Bureau. So, the Freedmen's Bureau is a federal agency, so that means that it gets funding from the federal government. And what the Freedmen's Bureau is going to do is go into the South and help the ex slaves adjust to their freedom. So, think about it. If these slaves or these ex slaves have been kind of held in bondage their entire life, they haven't had the ability to go out and get an education, or and they have never had to go out and provide for themselves because their masters are the ones that provided for them. That's a lot to adjust to. It's like taking a small child out of their mom and dad's reach and just throwing them out into the world and basically allowing them to fend for themselves. Well, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to try to prevent that from happening. They're going to give some food to the freedmen. They're going to give them the ability to build a house. Uh, and they're also going to give them education. That's going to be the most important. Under stuff like the slave codes, these slaves were not able to get any type of education. Most of them were illiterate. They didn't know how to read or write. And people from the north, and you see this is a white woman, she's probably from the north, she would go into the South, and other people like her would go into the South and teach not just freedmen's children, but freedmen themselves how to read and how to write. And for the first time in their lives, people They might be, 50 or 60 years old, but they're learning how to read and write for the first time as a result of the Freedmen's Bureau. So what the radical Republicans are going to do is try to punish the South, and they're going to do that with the Military Reconstruction Act. And so they're going to divide the South up into separate districts. So there's going to be 5 districts across the South, and they're going to put a few states in each district, and they're going to assign a Union general to kind of run that district within the South. And so whenever the South is going to be controlled by Union generals, they're not going to have any choice but to do what the radical Republicans, what the Union wants them to do. Well, what are the radical Republicans wanting the South to do? They're going to want them to respect black rights. They're going to want them to uphold the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They're going to want to allow uh, the southern states to allow for the blacks to vote in the South. They're going to want them to have equal protection under the law. And under this Military Reconstruction Act, it is successful, at least for the time period that it's in effect. Black rights will be respected in the South. We've already talked about how blacks are going to be elected to positions of power in the South. The Republican Party, with the votes of freedmen, are going to become is going to become dominant in the South, at least for a little while. Now, eventually, the Military Reconstruction Act will go away, but for the few years that it was effective and being enforced, uh, it was very, very successful. The black rights were respected in the South because of it. Whenever this goes away, though, the South will not respect black rights after the Military Reconstruction Act. Um, and we're going to start to see people like Andrew Johnson come into power. And he became president after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And really, the thing that's most important about Andrew Johnson is that he fought with Congress a lot. The radical Republicans, they had a supermajority in Congress, and if you've had civics, you know that that means that they can override a president's veto. So Congress might pass something like the Freedmen's Bureau. Andrew Johnson did not like the Freedmen's Bureau, so he would veto it. The radical Republicans would override that veto, and it would go into law or go into effect anyway. Well, still yet, they viewed Andrew Johnson as sort of a roadblock to their power, and so they came up with some, reason to impeach him. It was not really a justifiable reason to impeach him. It was something like, you can't fire anyone in your cabinet unless the Senate approves of it, or something like that. A it's just an excuse to allow for people to say Andrew Johnson violated the law, let's impeach him. Well, he was impeached by the House of Representatives, but he's not going to be convicted. Another thing, if you've had civics, is you will know that the Senate must vote on the impeachment of the House of Representatives. If the Senate does not vote to convict the president, then he can stay in power. Well, by one vote, the Senate will not convict Andrew Johnson, and he will be allowed to remain in power. So this goes to show, it sets a precedent that you cannot impeach presidents just for political reasons. If you're going to impeach a president and remove that president from office, then it has to be for a crime, not because you disagree with the president. And really, that's why the radical Republicans wanted him impeached. They just didn't agree with him, and they wanted him out of the way. But because of him not being convicted, that didn't happen. So, what you're going to see during the time period of Reconstruction are people from the North moving into the South, and what they're going to be called are carpetbaggers. So, carpetbaggers are people like this guy here, and they're going to move into the South not really for a good reason. They're not going to want to go into the South and help promote black rights. We talked about the Freedmen's Bureau and how there were white teachers that would go into the South and help teach the former slaves how to read and write. Well, the carpetbaggers are not going to do that. They're going to move to the South to take advantage of the South. They're going to want to gain some. They're basically going to want to make money off of the South. They're going to sell them things. They're going to go into the Southern government and try to run things in the Southern government. They're going to try to, embezzle money, which means take money out of the South. And they're not here for a really good reason, and because they're not there for a good reason, the whites in the South are not going to like the carpetbaggers. It's going to make them feel even more resentful as a result of the Civil War. There's going to be some people in the South that are going to be called scalawags that are going to help these carpetbaggers, and the South is really not going to like them. They're not going to like the carpetbaggers either, obviously, because they're basically taking advantage of the South. The South had been defeated in the Civil War. Their economy was not that good, and whenever someone is that vulnerable, it's easy to take advantage of them. And that's what the carpetbaggers did, and the South did not like that. So, something that's going to happen in the South after the Civil War is the formation of the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK. And so, after these Civil War amendments was passed, and after the Military Reconstruction Act was passed, uh, the 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 Southern whites are going to view those laws as a threat to their power. They're going to look at them, those laws as giving the blacks power and saying, well, they've never had power before. We didn't even recognize them as people, and now we're going to have to give them rights. Well, this was formed in a reaction to that. The whites in the South did not want them to have power or to have rights, and the KKK is going to be a secret group that's going to try to intimidate the Southern blacks into not using those rights. So they would put on masks, they'd even put a mask on their horse, and they would go up, they'd go on famous things called a midnight ride. And if you were a victim of a midnight ride, that meant that you were a Southern black. These people would come to your house and they would intimidate you. They would yell at you. They would threaten you. They might even they murdered some people. And if these people are coming to your homes, are you going to feel like and doing stuff like that? Are you going to feel like you have rights? No, you're not. And so they're going to try to get the blacks in the South to not use their rights, and they're going to go after not only the Southern blacks, they're going to have to go after people that moved into the South, the carpetbaggers. They're going to go after them too, and they're going to fight back against that. And eventually, they will be successful because the radical Republicans will lose power. They will be replaced with more moderate Republicans that are not going to treat the South as harshly or as more forcibly, and the KKK will gain a lot more power after that. So the KKK will gain power especially after this, the Compromise of 1877. So at this point, I've kind of been, hinting at this for a while now. The radical Republicans are going to lose power in Congress. They're going to be replaced with Republicans that are not as passionate about upholding black rights and stuff like that. And when they're not as passionate about upholding black rights, then stuff like the Military Reconstruction Act is not going to be something they view as worth fighting for. So, with the Compromise of 1877, there's going to be a Democrat that runs against this guy, Rutherford Hayes. Rutherford Hayes is a Republican, but he is a moderate Republican. He is not a radical Republican. He does not care very much about protecting black rights. And there's going to be where the election is going to be thrown into the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives is going to have to decide the president. Well, the Democrats in the House will say, "We will let you, Rutherford Hayes, we will let you become president if you agree to end Reconstruction." And Rutherford Hayes said, "You know what? I don't care very much about black rights anyway. I want to be president, so I'm going to take you up on that deal." That was the Compromise of 1877. Rutherford Hayes, a Republican, became president, but he did so because he ended Reconstruction. The the troops in the South will be drew out of the South, and there's going to be no more generals that are controlling the South. And when this happens, you're going to open Pandora's box in the South because they can do effectively whatever they want when it comes to black rights, and they're not going to treat blacks very well as a result of this. And so there's still going to be this idea of a new South that happens after the Civil War, but it's not a accurate term because it really did not happen. What you're going to see is that there will be some factories that come up in the north, or excuse me, in the south, That's called industrialization. Whenever you get more factories and stuff like that, more machines in the South, and you are going to see that in the South. There will be some minor industrialization in the South, but that does really not, in and of itself, make it a new society because there's going to be the oppression of blacks in the South. These freedmen are still going to be oppressed, especially after the Compromise of 1877. And so this term is not accurate because the blacks in the South are still oppressed. There's really nothing new about it. If you went and asked these people if their life was any better because of Reconstruction and after the Compromise of 1877, they're probably going to say no. In fact, they would say it could be worse because things like the KKK and lynching is going to happen. And, they probably know of people that have been murdered by the KKK. So life really didn't get better for them. That's why it's not accurate to say a new South formed after the Civil War. An example of that oppression of blacks will be sharecropping. So, sharecropping is a system that is very, very similar to slavery. And what you're going to see is that these freedmen are, in some cases, going to go back to their former master's plantation to work. And they're going to work in the same cotton fields they worked in while they were slaves. The only difference is that they're going to technically be paid for the crops that they harvest. But the problem with that is they're going to have to share a insanely high percentage of what they make from selling this cotton with their former masters, with the white landowners. And whenever you do this, you're going to basically restrict the southern blacks to a system of poverty. They're never going to be able to move up and gain any wealth. They're never going to be able to move into the middle class. And so their lives are really not going to be that better. They're still working for their master. They're not making hardly any money. That's really the only difference is that whenever they were slaves, they did not make any money. With sharecropping, they do technically make money, but it's such a small amount that they're not that much better off. And so they were tied to this system. They didn't have anywhere else to go. They could not go out and get a job in any other way or any other field. They're going to have to work in agriculture. They're going to have to work in the cotton fields. They don't have any other choice and they have to stay in that system. So, if a slave code is not requiring them to stay in the cotton fields, the sharecropping system is going to require them to stay in the cotton fields. So, it's a system that's very, very similar to slavery. Another thing that's going to happen to restrict the rights of Southern blacks is Plessy versus Ferguson. So there's going to be a case that's going to come up. There's going to be a guy named Homer Plessy. He's going to be riding a train car. This guy, he is 1/8 African American, so he's majority white, but still yet the South is going to tell him that he cannot ride in a train car with other white people. And so he's going to take his case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to rule that in the South, if they want to, they can divide up the races, they can divide whites and blacks as long as they treat the whites and blacks equal when they are separate. Now, that really is not going to work out. And before I get into why it won't work out, you can look at the picture here and see how it's not going to work out. Look at the white water fountain. That looks very new. It looks clean, and it looks very modern. It looks like a good water fountain. Look here at the colored, which was a term they would use for blacks in the South. Look at its water fountain. That's an old water fountain. It's not as big. It's very run down. Look at the piping. Whenever the water that the whites drink would go down the drain, look where it would go. It would go into the black water fountain. So they're basically drinking the after water of the white people. So that's not true equality. They are separate, but that is not equal. And eventually that will be overturned in American history too with Brown versus Board of Education. But that's not going to prevent, but that is preventing equality in the South. And it's going to prevent equality because the whites and the blacks are never going to be together. And whenever these two groups of people are separate, You're not going to know anything about that other group. You're not going to interact with people from that other group. And when you're not interacting with people in that group, then you're going to be able to stigmatize them. You're going to be able to say untrue things about them and form really unjust and unfair stereotypes about that group. And whenever these stereotypes come up, you don't know anything about that group, then they're a lot easier to buy into. And whenever they're easier to buy into, you can treat these Southern blacks very bad and get away with it because of that stereotype that you've came up with in your head. So this is really going to be instrumental in establishing this separate but equal doctrine, but it's not equal, and you can definitely see how in this picture. So the last term we need to talk about is disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement is a way that the South would try to get or try to undo the 15th Amendment. Keep in mind, the 15th Amendment said that the ex male slaves had the right to vote. Well, what they're going to do in the South is take away that right to vote. But they're not going to do it just by saying, well, if you're a black person, you do not have the right to vote. They're going to do it kind of under a separate system of doing that without having to explicitly say it. So they're going to do poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. A poll tax means that you have to pay money so you can go vote. Well, if you're a Southern white, you probably have more money than a Southern black because of the sharecropping system. They didn't have very much money at all, the Southern blacks, under the sharecropping system, so you cannot pay a poll tax. If you can't pay the poll tax, then you cannot go vote. A literacy test. Well, the Freedmen's Bureau did, help some people, some ex-slaves get an education and to read, but the Freedmen's Bureau will not be around for very long. Most Southern blacks still cannot read, and whenever you cannot read, then you cannot vote because you'd have to prove that you could read and you could write to vote. And when they couldn't do that, the Southern whites would say, "Well, sorry, you don't meet the qualifications to vote." Third part, a grandfather clause. This means that if your grandfather did not have the right to vote, then you did not have the right to vote. Well, think about that. If you are a Southern black in this time period, think late 1800s, your grandfather was a slave. So your grandfather did not have the right to vote at all because he was not a citizen. They didn't even consider him a human, so he definitely did not have the right to vote. Well, think about your grandchildren. You don't have the right to vote, so your grandchildren are not going to have the right to vote because their grandfather could not vote. And so this way, you kind of set up a system to where no Southern black will ever be able to vote because their grandfather was never able to vote. So this was really this was probably the cruelest of all three of these because you're basically banning people from voting for life simply because of their race, but you're being very disingenuous about it because you're not allowing them to vote, and it's because of their race. You know it's because of their race, but you're doing it under kind of a separate system, under a guise of allowing people the right to vote and not banning it because of their race. But if you're not banning it because of their race, you come up with another way to do it and just call it something different. So it's not a good system. Disenfranchisement, undoing the 15th Amendment. So that is the end of Unit 7. I know this one was a little bit longer than the others, but the Civil War and Reconstruction is very, very important. So go ahead, use the notes from this screencast and take the Unit 7.